Now, the last chapter that we're reading is the chapter on establishing objectives and budgeting for the promotional program. It's so important to set clear objectives. We know that they're important in terms of, you know, being able to articulate what we're trying to achieve, not only internally, but we need to articulate that to our agency partners and whoever else is involved in the marketing communication planning process. And ultimately, we need to be able to measure to see if we actually achieved what we shot out to achieve. So that's another reason why we need clear objectives. Our book does a great job of delineating between marketing objectives and IMC objectives. And it basically says that marketing objectives are the objectives that are to be accomplished by the overall marketing plan. And remember, marketing is not just about promotions. Marketing includes product decisions, place or distribution decisions, and pricing decisions. So marketing objectives can affect any of those areas, whereas integrated marketing communications objectives will only affect the IMC elements of the marketing plan. And so typically that's everything under the promotions P. So it's important to know what the marketing plan overall should achieve, but also how does that translate to what we want to achieve just from the promotions portion of the plan, the communications aspect. So our book talks about sales-oriented objectives and the importance of those. Lots of companies like to use those because they're pretty concrete. You can get data very easily to know how you're doing in your sales, whether it's not just sales, but profitability, market share, any of those types of numbers. Brands are tracking those numbers all the time. And it's very tempting to only use those numbers when we're assessing our marketing programs, but they're not always the best metric, and they don't always tell the whole story for they don't always tell the marketing story clearly, but they're still important. And we definitely should track them as from the brand management's perspective, you have to track those numbers. But the challenge is sales are impacted by a lot more than just advertising and promotion. Obviously there are external factors like the competitive landscape, the economy, even changes in the technology can affect your sales. But from an internal perspective, your product quality, your pricing, your distribution strategy, they can all affect your sales. If you have a great product, but you are only distributing through a handful of outlets because you haven't finished selling it into all the key retailers, then that's a problem. If you have a great product, but you've priced it out of the market and you're priced way above everybody else, that could be a problem. So all of that can affect your sales. So even if you have the best marketing communication plan, if those other elements are not, where they should be, then it could, sales won't tell the story in terms of how your plan performed. And that's one of the biggest challenges of using sales. Not to mention that there are other challenges in terms of the lag time between seeing the result of your advertising. So communications objectives are designed to speak more to what you're trying to achieve from a communication standpoint. So the overall goal here typically ties into one of those, if you look back at chapter 5, even as you're watching this, you could flip back to the chapter 5 figure that we saw with all the 4 different models. And I'm going to see if I can tell you what figure that was. But the 4 different models that go through the cognitive, affective, and behavioral stages. Remember we looked at that? Well, there are communication, you could literally write communication goals for each of those stages. So for example, and I'm just looking at the hierarchy of effects model, that's one that's sometimes used. At that first stage, you're trying to get awareness and you're trying to build awareness. So your communication objective could be to increase awareness by 20% by the end of Q3. Now, that sounds great, but one of the challenges of communication objectives is that sometimes you don't have a benchmark to know, okay, is that the right percentage increase, or is that not even realistic? So, and I think I'm getting ahead of myself on the slides, but it's still good to craft specific communication objectives that tell you that specify what you want the plan to achieve. What is that marketing communication plan? Not the marketing plan as a whole, but what does the marketing communications plan need to achieve? And at the end of the day, you remember that chart again? I didn't tell you, it's figure 5-3. At the end of that line, at the bottom, all of those, there was some sort of behavior that we were looking for, some sort of action, a purchase behavior of some type. And that's the goal, is even in this communication process, we want there to be some sort of action. What can they do? But every level, you can communicate at every level of these charts. So even at the cognitive and affective stages, you communicate there, and you could have different objectives. So depending on where you are in the process, you're either trying to get the consumer to think a certain way, to feel a certain way, or to behave a certain way towards your product. There's this communications effects pyramid, and most, when you launch a new product, you start at the bottom trying to get awareness for it. And that tends to, you need to use, most companies use mass market advertising types of vehicles, but in a smaller business or a nonprofit, that's usually not an option. So you have to think of creative ways to gain awareness. Are there any other companies you could work with to sort of to piggyback on their efforts, or to companies that may have access to a large percentage of people in your target, or a large portion of people in your target. So once you have achieved the goal of awareness, then the next stage, you want to get them to know more about the product and to comprehend what your product offers to them. And then you want to get them to the point of liking it and preferring your product, and then ultimately trying your product and hopefully buying it again. You'll notice, though, at each stage there's a percentage next to each stage, and that percentage is the number, or the percent of prospective customers that you have at each stage. So you notice that customer pool shrinks every time, because you're only able to successfully, reach a certain percentage of those, and so it kind of decreases, as you go up. But the thing to remember here is that each phase of this communication effects grid, you can have a different communication objective. And so it depends on where you are in this process. And I mentioned these problems already. Some of the problems with using communications objectives, they're really sometimes hard to gauge what the right number is in terms of liking and preference and awareness. And even in a nonprofit, they don't often have the resources to conduct the research and to do what needs to be done in terms of working with outside agencies to measure these things, these awareness numbers and things like that. Whereas larger companies, larger businesses and brands are able to do that. So a lot of this is just, there are no formulas. A lot of it's just from experience. And imagine that's true for larger companies. So imagine the challenges with smaller companies and nonprofits. But it's still important to be able to define clear objectives, so that you kind of know if you succeeded in what you tried to do. So even though it's challenging, it's still important to do that. And in your project, you're not going to be required to measure awareness. So even if you use awareness as an objective and state your rationale, that's perfectly fine. If you expect there to be a growth in awareness by 25% by a certain amount of time, just state your rationale. And, we know the client may or may not be able to measure, to do the work to find out what the awareness is. But there may be some things we can do. You might be able to survey a small portion of your target at an economical price. So there are some options for smaller businesses, but don't let that hold you back from creating clear communications objectives. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but the Dagmar model is laid out in our book, both the original model and the revised, or Model 2, I think they call it. But the goal of this model was to really give a way to measure how effective advertising is, and sure, it's challenging to do, but the really neat thing about this model is that it was developed to help companies set advertising objectives and then ultimately measure the results of their campaigns. And it follows this, the person who developed this model proposed that there's this hierarchy of communications that includes the first level of awareness, the second level of comprehension, and then the third level of conviction, which is a new one. I think we saw the other two in other models, but conviction is more of a mental disposition to get ready to buy the product, but then the action is the ultimate purchase. So a lot of these models look similar, but they're just different nuances of it. But this model is a popular model for setting objectives and for assessing the effectiveness of advertising and promotional campaigns. So when you're setting objectives, which you'll be doing next week for your project, they should be clear, they should be concrete and measurable. We use the acronym SMART, and I'll talk more about that in the actual live session. But they should be SMART objectives. They should, be clearly defined in terms of who the target is, what action you're trying to get them to make, and what time period you want to accomplish that. Now there's another section in this chapter about budgeting, which is extremely important. In our situation, so there are two ways budgeting can happen. One is top down and one's bottom up. Top down is where you basically are given a number from management, and you have to stay within that number. It's pretty straightforward, but there are a lot of different varieties of top down models. Then bottom up is basically you create the budget based on what you're trying to achieve in the marketing communication plan. You outline what you're trying to achieve, how you can achieve that, and the specific tactics for achieving that objective. But then you figure out what will each tactic cost you, and that's the way you build the budget. It's sort of a bottom-up approach. And one variety of the bottom-up approach is the objective and task method, which is talked about in our book. It's where you define your communications objectives, and then you determine the strategies that you'll implement to achieve those objectives. And then you determine the cost to execute those strategies and the tasks associated with those strategies. The tasks, or tactics as we call them in the class. So that approach makes a lot of sense for a situation like what we're in, working with our client who hasn't really given us a dollar amount to target for the budget. To be honest, I'm sure the resources are tight, so keep that in mind as you're building your bottom-up approach and you're selecting your strategies and tactics and what types of media channels you'll use. You have to keep the resources of the client in mind as you do that. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a call or send an email.